Well, let me start by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Israel, and this is what I feel like inside. I'm really excited. I grew up in India, and Israel has been a dream place for me to come to visit since I think very early on. And this is Mrs. Sehgal. I don't have a picture of her. She was a teacher in my school when I was in 4th grade. I remember all of us sitting in this big auditorium on the floor. You know, you can imagine 2nd, 3rd, 4th graders all wiggling. And she decided to tell us a story about her husband who was on an airplane who got hijacked, and used that as a way of telling us the history of Israel. And I remember that moment even today. What a great teacher can do in connecting you with the world. And then as I grew older, I got really interested in the history of the Second World War, and that led me to read a lot of books. And have always been impressed by the history of Israel, of its people, and its long story. So it's just genuinely a pleasure to be here. And I found another connection. This is the tale of 2 prime ministers. So this is Ben-Gurion and India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, both caught in an interesting pose. And then when I was walking on the beach, I found this statue, and I of course had to take a picture with that. So a little bit about myself and my dream, which is to be on The Simpsons. So that's how it would look like. I'm currently in the United States, have been there for a while. As I was introduced, I'm Associate Dean for Scholarship and Innovation. That's my contact information over there. My background, I actually have an undergraduate degree in engineering, and after that, degrees in design, wanted to be a filmmaker, ended up in a roundabout way in education, doing educational research, mostly around educational technology, creativity, and teacher education, some of which I will share with you today. Of course, I'm also a parent of 2 kids. Husband to Smita sitting right here. I've also been on the school board of our local school district, so a range of different things. I am at the Meru Teachers College, which is in Arizona State University, which brands itself as being the new American university, the new model for what higher education can be. I'd like to share some of that with you later today. One of the things we are really proud of is that we have been regarded as being #1 in innovation. I'm contractually obligated to say this every time I say Arizona State, because you'll see if you come to visit Phoenix, you'll see the buses going around telling everybody we got #1 in innovation. So maybe we say that too often, I think. So one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is sort of the future of education, of higher education, and the role of technology. And the reason I'm interested in the future is because I'm going to spend a lot of time in the future. The only problem is prediction is very difficult, especially for the future. Most of my work has been in the field of technology and education. I want to give a little bit of sort of work around which was mentioned earlier around the TPACK framework, but then move on to certain other issues and challenges that I think that we as educators face today. So a big focus of my work is in this idea of what is it that teachers need to know to successfully and smartly integrate technology in their teaching. So in this, I was assisted by my partner, which is Matthew Kaler, who's, if you look at my work, you'll always find it's either Mishra and Kaler, or Kaler and Mishra. So that's what he looks like if he was in the South Park. He used to have a ponytail, he doesn't have that now. That's me. Matt looks actually quite cool with glasses, without glasses. And I think we formed an ideal partnership. And if you think about a good partnership, it's like a hot air balloon. A hot air balloon needs hot air, otherwise it would stay on the ground, right? It has to go up, and it needs a ballast to keep it. And so I am the hot air, and Matt is the ballast. I joke about that because I'm excitable, I get excited about things, and I start running in all kinds of directions. Matt is a very sharp, analytic mind, keeps me grounded and together. I think we've done a lot of good work together. Oh, hot air balloon. Oh, there it is. That's me. And Matt is holding me down over there. So it's perfect. Thank you. That's perfect. I planned that. Thank you. That's perfect. Actually, Can somebody get a picture of this? That'd be funny. So one of the questions we sort of asked ourselves is, what is this thing called an educational technology? Because there are lots of these tools and technologies that are around us, everything from a crayon to Facebook to video games. A magnifying glass, is that an educational technology, right? And one of the things we say is that there is no such thing as an educational technology. So if you look at this, scientific calculator, how many children do you see walking around with a scientific calculator in their pockets? Very few, nobody, pretty much, because it's a single function device. What we carry instead is this, which can be a scientific calculator, and it can be a lot of different things because there is an app for that, right? One of the things that when we talk about these devices in the classroom that teachers often say is this idea of loss of control, right? So what they say is, when I am teaching, let's say the Pythagorean theorem, somebody's on YouTube, somebody's texting, but actually that's not real loss of control. Real loss of control is when you are teaching the Pythagorean theorem, some kid in the back has found another proof that you don't know. Now there's a reason why you are an educator in front, because you are supposed to know everything. But this access to information can sort of subvert that. So one of the big challenges there is that most technologies are not designed for educational purposes. Right? If you look at Microsoft Excel, or if you look at any software pretty much that we use for the most part, they have been designed for business, they have been designed for everyday use, so on and so forth. But one of the strengths of educators that I think is that we as users can redefine what technologies are created for. So one of my favorite examples is email. How many of you here have sent an email to yourself? Can I see show of hands? It's a very strange group of people. Right? It's like talking to yourself. Why are you doing that? But you do that for a lot of reasons. You send a note to yourself, you want to work on a file at home, it's easy to email it, you want to keep a record of stuff. Right? So email was not designed for any of those purposes, but we can very easily use it for that. If you have to open the door, keep it open, you don't think twice before taking a chair to prop it there. The chair was not designed for that purpose, but we as users can do that. So I collect examples of things like this. So here is one, which is a bicycle and a lawnmower. This is a Chinese restaurant where they use clothespins to keep track of orders. Very simple. This is from India. It's called a Maruta. It's basically a truck which is built from pieces that you find in the junkyard, and it goes at like 5 kilometers an hour, and the piece falls off, and you go and tie it up again. And the question is, why is this important? This is important because only repurposing makes a technology an educational technology. It's when we take what's out there, think of a way of integrating it in our practice, that something becomes an educational technology. So Twitter is a good example. Twitter was not designed for education, clearly. But in higher ed, I use it a lot in what I call a microblogging back channel. But as we are doing readings in class, students can, using the right hashtags, be tweeting out their thoughts and sharing it with the rest of the class. So you can think about it that way, right? So repurposing is a creative and an innovative act. And through that, technology changes both how we teach and what we teach. So looking at how we teach. So one of the greatest educational innovations, technological innovations, is this one. If you think about it, for the first time in the history of human civilization, and almost all of human knowledge is accessible to a kid in Tanzania, to a kid in Tel Aviv, to a kid sitting in Phoenix, Arizona. As long as you have internet connection, you have access to it. Now people tell me that, oh, but you can't trust the information, so on and so forth. So that brings me to my 23rd law of parenting. The 23rd law of parenting is, for facts, go to Google, for wisdom, come to me. Right? And that's kind of the role of the educator now. It's thinking about, not about imparting information, but really imparting ways of thinking and analyzing and being critical about that information. And if you look at the way technology has changed, if you look at the open courseware, you look at Web 2.0, you look at this idea that you can bring your own devices to classrooms, you think of all these apps. If, it was mentioned already, I couldn't understand everything in the Hebrew, but I could understand book. So you have books. So technology is fundamentally changing how we teach. The other aspect, which I don't think people pay enough attention to, is the fact that technology is changing what we teach. If you look at any fact of human activity today, whether it's physics or mathematics or music or art, it has been fundamentally changed by technology. Just look, I have a friend who's an astrophysicist. I don't think he has looked in a telescope for a decade. What he does, he buys time on Hubble or some other telescope, gets petabytes of data, and he writes programs which allow him to understand black hole dynamics or whatever that he studies. Music is another great example. Everything from how we compose music, how we record it, how we share it, how we sell it, how we buy it, how we listen to it, has been changed because of technology. So if you want our students to get an authentic experience of creating music or doing mathematics, technology has to be a part of that. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of it, but it has to be a part of that. So my favorite example is this one, is the periodic table of elements. So if you look at that set of elements that's in the bottom there, actually it should be there. Why is it there? Any guesses? Anybody? It has to do with the technology of print. So if you make it that big, it's hard to print, then you have to make a fold out, which is more expensive. So that's a classic example of a very traditional technology changing how information and knowledge is represented. And funny thing is, chemists have created hundreds of different representations of the periodic table, three-dimensional ones, circular ones, all of these. And these are often not accessible to students because we don't print them in textbooks, we don't look at them, right? But with the advent of technology, you can now create these tables that you can dynamically interact with, that you can zoom in, zoom out on. So two things I've been trying to say is, one is that technology changes how we teach, technology changes what we teach. And where that happens is in specific contexts. So if you're in a classroom where every child has a laptop or every student has a laptop, that's a very different context from this one, which is a classroom in India that I visited where you have a computer lab, internet may or may not work. So if you are teaching photosynthesis in the previous classroom versus here, you have to approach it differently. You cannot take the same solution that works in one classroom and apply it to another. Or in a place where children have these devices or students have devices where they can take pictures, make video, it changes the context. So this is what led Matt and me to come up with this idea of what it is that teachers need to know, that it has to be a knowledge of technology, pedagogy, of how that is to be used, and subject matter. So what it is that you need to know, how we're going to be conveyed, and how it's going to be represented using these technologies. But these are not seen in isolation from each other. You see them as an overlap, right? So as educators, we all sit at that intersection, at the intersection of content, pedagogy, and technology. And so we were not very imaginative, so when we first came up with it, we called it the TPCK framework, which nobody knew how to pronounce because it had no vowels in it. And so people would say, is this the toothpick framework? What is it? So we bought a vowel. You know, in the game, you can go buy a vowel, $50, right? So we bought a vowel, and it became the TPACK framework, okay? And the TPACK framework, we try to think about it sort of as the total package for thinking about technology integration in education. And so the point is that whether you're using a chalkboard or a paper and pencil, that's a technology too, or a computer, or you're using the web, teaching has always been about TPACK. The next few slides, I'm going to jump through that slides I have so that I feel good about the work, but it's not really important to the ideas. The article was written in 2006. A lot of people have cited it. There are 2 handbooks. What's amazing to me is the number of articles and others that have been written around this framework. But most important has been for me, and I think for Matt as well, the impact this line of work has had on practice. So I have heard even in the few days I have been here from people talking about either that they did their dissertation on it or they're thinking about how their program of teacher preparation can sort of use TPACK as a framework for integrating technology. A few years back we were in Australia, Matt and I were invited where all 40 teacher college institutions across the nation were using that as a guiding framework. So that is very meaningful because it means that the work that we have done sitting back then in East Lansing, Michigan, has an impact beyond where we are. But I think one of the things we need to think about, and I want to share a little bit about that, is to understand that technology can help us see and teach, but only if we see technology the right way, right? And so how many of you know about this Khan Academy? Most of you know about it, right? So I got curious about it, so I said, how does Salman Khan learn? Right? He's out there doing his thing. How does he learn? And so here's a video clip about Salman Khan talking about how he learns. Let's see if the volume is working.
I approach it from what my brain would like to see. Like, what would the ideal, and for me, in history in particular, and I don't feel like I got this in the history books, and even now when I prepare, I'm not getting it from the history books on my shelf, is like, I like to see a scaffold, I like to see a map. I like to, you know, what is the Holy Roman Empire? Like, what is that now?
Well,
like,
the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman,
right.
what are these things? You know, people can just keep referring to them, but if I can't. So I like to, so what I do is, for history, I immerse myself in as much as possible. I usually read Wikipedia entry first, just to get the scaffold. And the beauty of also Wikipedia, if I find cool maps along the way, I copy and paste. You know, I make sure they're in the public domain. I copy and paste, stick it on my my little Blackboard art program, and sometimes I'll draw out a timeline just to make sure I get the years right. But the main thing I do, whether it's history or chemistry or anything, is get the scaffold and then really immerse myself for however long it takes, and then make sure that I can make intuitive connections between everything that happens, and, you know, and understand why something, you know, if I'm doing it on the neuron, why, you know, a biology book will tell you, okay, the signal goes across because there's a myelin sheath. And I'd kind of ponder it a bit, and then I was like, wait, it's kind of like a fiber optic system, and you can, one's kind of amplifying the signal, but if you amplify too, and then I'd call up some buddies who are either biologists or communications engineers, whatever. I was like, does this make sense? They're like, no, I think you're right. And so it's a big deal for me to, if I'm doing biology, why does the myelin sheath make the signal go faster? If it's history, wait, why did this artillery captain all of a sudden come to power? Like were there other people around? Like, these obvious questions are important for me to answer. Yeah. And what's really cool is sometimes you call a buddy and you're like, I know you're gonna think I'm stupid when I ask you this, and you're probably gonna think I have no business making a video on this considering I'm asking this question, but, you know, why does the sarcoplasmic reticulum release these ions when this happens? And they're like, you know what, we don't know.
So here's a summary of what, how Salman Khan learns. He immerses himself in the topic, he scaffolds, he annotates, he tries to make intuitive connections, he tries to understand why, he ponders, he makes analogies between this and that, he calls up his friends, he asks obvious questions, however long it might take him to do that. Then he designs a video and he puts it out there in the world, and people give feedback and they say, oh, you got that wrong, and then he goes and fixes it. Now, how does Salman Khan recommend that our children learn or we learn? He says, watch the video. What's wrong with that picture? If you think about what Salman Khan describes and how he himself learns, he actually captures the best that we know of how learning happens. It requires engagement, it requires immersion, it requires connecting with other people, it requires making mistakes, it requires repetition and revision. And so one of the questions that as educational technologies, I think all of us need to ask ourselves. And so every time I see somebody come to me and say, I have the solution to education's problem, my question is, would you want your child to have that? We see a lot of this in technology where we see people offering solutions. Oh, we can give them online, we can give them. It's always for the other people's kids. Our kids go to a special school, they get coaching in this, they get support for that. So ask yourself the question whenever you think about anything is this something that I would do for my child? Right? A very important article is this one, if you can Google this, please read this. It's called The Reductive Seduction of Other People's Problems, which is people who are further away from us, it's easier for us to find or define solutions for them. The closer we are to the issue, we realize how complicated it is. So it's very easy for somebody sitting in America to say, oh, we have the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, just as you guys sitting here can say, oh, we have the answer to America's gun problem. you see what I'm saying? It's the further we are from the problem, the simpler it looks to us. And I think that's really important to understand. So here are some other examples of how one can think about technology and learning. So the 3 quick examples. This was a classroom in Italy where students computed the distance to the moon. And if you go to the NASA website, you can actually download the audio recording, the audio files, so you can hear what Mission Control and Neil Armstrong or Aldrin were talking. And if you have done a long distance phone call, sometimes you get an echo. How many of you have had that? You get an echo back, right? You say something, then you hear your own voice come back in a long distance call sometimes. That's there in the recording. So sound traveled to the moon and back. And so these people, students, took the recording and computed using this. How many of you know this software called Audacity? What is Audacity? It's for editing music. It's like Photoshop for sound. So what they did was, instead of using it to edit music, they used it as for data analysis, because now they can compute the time difference between one sound and the other. And using that, they could compute the distance to the moon. So what was intelligent in this for me was the teacher who thought that Audacity could be used as a data analysis tool, right? So that's repurposing a tool in a new way. Here's another one. How many of us have seen problems like this in math textbooks? Right, so they'll give you a problem, compute the volume or surface area of this truncated pyramid. Then they'll say, first, compute the area of the base. What is the this? What is that? They walk you through the steps, so which means the student has done no learning at all. They've basically just handheld the way through the problem. So you can remove those steps. That's a little better. But can we make it even better? So this is a short video that I made when I was teaching in Chicago. Okay? So I just walked out into the street, and this is the video I made. That's it. And the question is, what's the volume of that yellow thing? Now realize what happens. The actual formula is the least important thing. You have to now compute, oh, how tall is it? Oh, the guy who was walking by was this tall, maybe. How wide was the bottom? Can I guess from the shoe? You are doing real mathematics. You are making estimation, you are making judgment calls. The formula is the least important thing. Oops, sorry. The other question that I get very often around technology is online versus face-to-face. So a question I get is, can online be as good as face-to-face? And my response to that often is this, right? And I want to turn the question on its head, somewhat like your former Prime Minister. And I ask the question, can face-to-face be as good as online? Because imagine if online had been there forever and somebody said, oh, we have to get everybody together in one room and exactly between time this and this, and you have to sit there, you'd think, oh, that's so frustrating. Couldn't we have the flexibility of... It's just what we are used to. The question is, what is it right for? So I had this class that I had taught for undergraduate students and in educational psychology. And the first activity that they did was a magic trick, right? And the way the magic trick works, it's based completely on information processing. And so they would, the computer could read your mind, and that would like blow everybody away. Then I would say, okay, how does this trick work? And they would have to type and post their answers. But imagine if in this room, if I showed the magic trick, and you figured out the answer, and you said, oh, Punya, this is the answer. Everybody else, even though they had not figured it out, we all say, yes, yes, yes. There was no way of knowing if you actually got it or somebody else actually understood it because they just heard you. But online, what I could do is you cannot see anybody else's answer till you have typed your own answer. That's an affordance that the online system allows me, that face-to-face doesn't. So the question really is, what are you wanting pedagogically to do? And some things are better done online and some things are better done face-to-face. And it's that we have to sort of try and figure out. So that's sort of implications for research practice and professional development around TPACK. And so the question then becomes, what do these examples tell us? Would these have been possible? So the examples that I showed 100 years ago, 10, maybe 5. And this is where I want to switch a little bit to looking towards the future, because I want us to think about what will be possible 5 years from now. And so in order to understand that, I'm going to look back 5 years, 2014 to 2019. So 2014, I was very enthusiastic. I was like about technology and all of that stuff. And I was invited to go to Chile, and which reminds me of the Chile, so that was good. And I like doing photography. And so I said, like, somebody told me that, if there is a spot, if you go there in Santiago, it's beautiful. So I went to the hotel, and I said, can I get a cab driver who speaks English? So they got me this guy who spoke no English. And so we were trying to communicate with each other, and we are going. And then he does this amazing thing. He pulls out his phone. Oh, the video's not working. Oh, shoot. Anyway, the video, I'm sorry. The video basically is he pulls out his phone, he speaks into it, it translates into broken English, then I speak in English, it translates it back, and that's how we communicated the whole day. Then it turns out that he has his own website, he has a band. It's like, this is so interesting. I'm here, Indian, working in the US, in Chile, on this phone with this guy. Most probably the phone was programmed by a bunch of Indians sitting in Bangalore. Right? It's really interesting, this world that we live in today. Right? And so this is 2014. We are looking at all these different tools and devices enveloping us. We are looking at this new social media emerging, all these tablets and devices, all these apps. You started seeing this new thing called 3D printing, where you could take ideas which are in your head, design it on the computer, and then it would become a real thing in the world. And it was an exciting time, honestly, because we knew there were challenges like this. More people have cell phones than toilets. That's scary when you think about it. But overall, the trend was positive, and I was optimistic, and I felt like we were on the right track. And now I realize how naive, at least I was. So there's this ancient Chinese curse saying, may you live in interesting times. Turns out that this was never a Chinese curse, so it may be an early example of fake news. And before we know it, suddenly we have Russian bots and Twitter hacks. We have Cambridge Analytica taking our data and manipulating. We have this thing of fake news. We have Facebook and Twitter being weaponized against us, using our own psychological things against us. And we have an understanding, we come to realize that these tools are being created to be addictive by design. This is a quote from Sean Parker where he says, Facebook was designed to exploit human vulnerability. And suddenly each one of us has a slot machine in our pocket, which is pinging us in ways to manipulate our propensities, our strengths, our weaknesses, all of it. And to realize that we were and are being manipulated by, I don't know how many of you know this term called black hat design, but it's deceptive use of persuasion tactics and unethical use of personal information. And please go look it up. It's fascinating. It has everything to do with where the cancel button is when you're on a website, how you opt out, how you opt in, which color the buttons need to be so that you stay on the site. It's fascinating to read this stuff. And so these become sort of the dark arts. And gradually, at every step, it's like, oh, every breach of privacy or trust by an organization or a company. Just yesterday, in fact, I don't even have this on here, the news that the US government has been secretly digitizing, analyzing every photograph on a driver's license. Completely illegal, but it's happening, right? This was a week ago, where every given moment Chrome is sending something like 100, or how much is this? 11,000 tracker cookies. And the sad thing is that these are attacking among the most vulnerable amongst us, right? Which are our children, which are people who don't know better. And the question then becomes like, how could we have predicted this?
And as people who are involved in technology and education, I think these are questions and issues that we need to be thinking more about. And so what will be possible 5 years from now? I could have never guessed the stuff kind of thing that we're seeing. Again, do not get me wrong. I am very positive about the power of technology to transform education, transform learning. It's been incredibly valuable for me personally, and I know lots of people. But there is a flip side to it that we need to be sensitive to. And so it requires that understanding the world that it is today, understanding the pace at which it is changing, understanding that we live in this fourth industrial revolution. I mean, we live in a world now where the world's largest taxi company has no cars. That's Uber. The largest hotel chain has no real estate. That's Airbnb. Right? Movie house owns no cinemas. I mean, it's a very interesting, different world that we're coming in. And it redefines what we mean when we say information in the palm of our hand. Right? The next slide is one of my favorite ones. It speaks to how long a particular technology took to reach 50 million users. The phone took 76 years, the internet took 4, Pokemon Go took 19 days. I mean, there is an amazing power in that. Now, whether it should be Pokemon Go or it should be something else, that's a different question. That's a question I think we need to be asking ourselves. But to also ignore the power that allows information to spread in this way, this fast. That's amazing. It's never ever happened in human society. And we are looking at newer things that are coming along: virtual reality, augmented reality, machine intelligence, artificial. I mean, each of these can be a talk or a session or a conference and so on. And these are going to change our lives. I was at a conference in Harvard recently where we were talking about this thing called the 60-year curriculum. The idea that people will live longer, that they will need to be educated on sort of an ongoing basis. And there was an economist and historian over there, and he said a couple of things which like really struck me. So one thing he said was, the 20th century created the idea of teenagers and retirement. What life stages will we create now? And I thought think about that for a second. The idea of teenagers seemed obvious to us. Retirement seems like an obvious thing. But for most of human civilization, after you were born, you were a certain age, you were working, you were doing stuff. And you kept doing stuff till you fell down and died. That there is a certain age where we will go to school and you will learn and then you will be prepared for the workforce. That's a very recent creation. The idea that after you've worked for so many years, you deserve to sit back and the government or whatever will take care of you, your retirement, that's a very recent idea. We tend to think of it as if it is the way things are, but no, not necessarily. And so the question becomes, as we live longer, what are the roles of higher education institutions? That's an important thing to think about. The other thing that he said is that we will have longer lives but shorter chapters. And I thought that was very interesting too. That we will move careers, that the world will change around us, that we will start out wanting to be a teacher and then we'll say, oh no, I want to do nursing. And then I want to try something else. I want to be a curator in a museum or whatever, I don't know. But each time organizations like we are a part of will have to think and rethink, how do we have to give degrees for everything? Does everybody have to come to college for 4 years? Is the way that we treat an undergraduate student who's 18 years old coming into the university the same way that we treat somebody who has worked for 10 years and wants to come back to college? These are, I think, very important questions for us to think about. And technology is clearly going to play a very important role in this. And the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, why has EdTech not transformed education as we know it? Like, what's missing? So one of the things to understand that technology is not just technology. The technology is deeply embedded in social practice. How many of you know of this thing called a missed call? Okay? So this is if you're in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or places like that, or Thailand, there's this idea of a missed call. So let's say I take a taxi and I say, okay, I want you to pick me up at the end. He says, okay, give me a missed call. Because in India, a call costs money. And so I can call the guy, I will ring 3 times, then I will cancel it, and 5 minutes later, he'll show up. So if your kid is going somewhere and you say, okay, give me a missed call when you reach there so that I know that you reach safely. So it turns out that there is a Wikipedia page for it. And at one point, it was a significant amount in Bangladesh. 70% of cellular network traffic was missed calls. Right? And that's changing now. But at one point, it was. And it's got its own emoji or icon. But understanding missed call is more than understanding this. To understand the phenomena of the missed call requires you to understand the economy, the culture, the location, everything of that place. So the meaning of this device is not just in this device. It is in the social, it is in the cultural, it is in the economic structures that make us use this. I think that's incredibly important to understand. I think one of the things that as educational technologists, we have focused on the tools, we have artifacts and the processes. Maybe experiences, we have not thought about the systems and the cultures within which these exist. So looking ahead, we see changes in demographics, we see changes in economics, technologies, of course. How much time do I have? 15? Okay. So I think one of the things we need to do is we have to truly understand and see who our learners are. And as we live longer lives, as our lives change, our narrative identities change. If you had talked to me, let's say 5 years ago when I was at Michigan State University, I was a professor, I felt if you'd asked me what do I need to learn, I would say, oh, I need to know more about X or Y. And then I took a job where I became associate dean. My narrative identity dramatically changed. Suddenly I needed to learn more about how to manage people, how to do budgets, stuff I hadn't cared about much before. So as we grow through life, our narrative identity changes. Our institutions currently are designed for a certain kind of a narrative identity. That you will graduate high school, and then you will go to college. Either you go to technical or you go to 4-year. But our narrative identities are going to be much more complicated than that. And so I think that thinking about career development across the lifespan, how our organizations can prepare for that, I think becomes incredibly important. So this is something that we've been working on at Arizona State, where we're looking at a student's what we call a journey map of how they discover about the program, how they choose, how they apply. So that's, I think, a really important thing for us to think about. And I think it's incredibly important that we think about the kinds of data that we are using. Because data is incredibly important in deciding what we do. But the problem here is we cannot just learn from who shows up. So if you look at the data on MOOCs, for instance, because there's a lot of data there, thousands of students. But if you look at the ones who complete the MOOCs, it's usually the ones who already have college degrees. So that's an interesting data point. It's an interesting thing to notice. And there's a lovely paper by this guy, Meany, who talks about 2 things. He says one is a hegemonic design bias, which is we tend to design things the way we think learning best happens. Like we have our own group of people, of instructional designers, technology people, psychologists, whatever, and we design things the way we think it should be. But the other flip side is that we don't know anything about those who don't show up. And who we are trying to reach are the ones who are not showing up. So if you look at the data from MOOCs and say, oh, this is how learners learn, you are going to get the data only from those who succeeded. We have to go and get information from the ones who did not show up. And that's a challenge. How do you get that data? But that's the group that we truly, truly have to reach. And so clearly we need new models and approaches to thinking about higher education, technology, and learning. So there's a couple of examples that at Arizona State we have been trying. So typically the model has been education to the learner, right? You come into the university, you get knowledge bumped into your head. That's our theory at least, right? But there are other models that one can have. And those usually have to do with the kinds of identities that we form. So one level you can have what is known as the personal identity. So that's me as a learner, developing as a person. I want to study anthropology, I do take 2 classes, then I don't like it, and then I say, okay, I'm going to go to major in English. You're developing your personal identity. But other identities are there as well. There's the professional identity. So for instance, Arizona State and Starbucks have a partnership. If you work at Starbucks, you can get a degree free from ASU. Over 6,000 students have already gotten that degree. And that taps into their identity of fitting in this organization. A third one could be, and we are still figuring this out, we don't have any clear partnerships on this yet, is like what other kinds of identities do we have? You could be a member of a cultural group. You could be a member of a religious group. You could be a member of the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts. Those are all identities that we have. And partnerships between those and universities or educational organizations can be very powerful. Again, the point here is that when we think about it, we are not just thinking about a tool or a technology. We are not just thinking about an artifact. We are thinking of processes and experiences, but most important, we are thinking of systems and culture. That when we think about technology, we have to think much more than just the tool itself. And so this is where the idea of design comes in. And this is some of my most current work that's going on. So thinking about the discourse of design, so one, we can talk about the artifact. It could be a website, blackboard.com, it could be an app, it could be a manipulative that you use in the classroom. The next are the processes. So if you think about the TPACK framework, so that's why this talk is called Beyond TPACK. TPACK framework focused on artifacts and processes. Maybe experiences, like what kind of a learning experience would a student have? What it didn't talk about were the systems and the culture. Sorry. And I think my work now, and this is sort of my nudge for the future, is, as we think about it, is to think about systems and culture. So we need to both understand the system and understand the culture, and design the system and design the culture. So one of the most fun interviews, we did a bunch of interviews with different designers as they work across different levels. One of the most fun one was with the president of Arizona State. When he first came to ASU 15 years ago, if you go look it up, ASU had a completely party school reputation. It was people came there to drink and have a good time. And in 15 years, he changed the track of the university. And we asked him, how did you do that? And he was a designer of the culture of the organization. It's a different place today than it was before. So I think it's time to rethink our approaches. So one of the things we say is this need for what we call principled innovation. So it's not just innovation, but it's innovation driven by some core values that drive us. I'm going to skip through a few of these. These are some of the partnerships that we've been doing. So I think we need to start thinking about our organizations as being learning organizations. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Lee Shulman. It said, learning is least useful when it is private and hidden. It's most powerful when it becomes public and communal. So we need to start thinking of ways of making our learning as organizations. So part of my job here is to share what we have learned with you and vice versa. And that culture is the stories that we tell and the values that we bring to the task. So I think if there's one thing for us to think about is thinking about what are the values and what are the broader culture that we bring to getting system exchange. Because without that, we will be like what's happening with Facebook and Twitter and so on. It leads to this, because of this lack of thought about deeper questions of the humanities, of values and stuff, that way we end up in this weird mess. So just to sum up, we live in a new ecology where standard solutions don't work. It is about creativity and repurposing, and we get there not through magic, but a purposeful process of design. So at some level, it is not about the technology, it is about deeper things than that, but it is about the technology because those are the things that we play and work with. Talked about the TPACK framework, the 5 Discourses of Design, and really to understand that there are many reasons for the global challenges we face. And one of the most important ones has been a failure of what education can be. And it is a failure not at an individual level, it is a failure at a systemic level. And so the challenge we face is to not to do a better job, but actually try to do a fundamentally different job. And if we have to ask fundamentally different questions, they have to emerge from fundamental issues, values that we bring from within, deeper within us, deeper humanistic values. And of course, the hope is that we leave it better than we found it. Thank you very much.